All right, we are on the downhill slide of lectures. We've got, excuse me, two lectures kind of talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. This is kind of a review back to the beginning of the semester. We're going to talk about some case studies, some examples of communities that are making progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. Then I've got an activity for you. It would have been what we did in class one day, so take some time with that. And then we got a wrap up. So the end is near, kids, in a good way. Not because we're all going to die of coronavirus. So when I say the end is near, it means there's not very many lectures you've got to slog through before we wrap up the semester. So going back to a little bit, really the beginning of the semester, and again, it feels like it was 100 years ago and not just a couple months. We focused on this idea of the Sustainable Development Goals and how that was a UN program really intended to identify some priorities for the entire world to work towards across scale. So at the international level, national level, in our case, state and cities as well, moving towards these goals. In different countries, obviously, they have different levels of government and structures, but for us, it means the national government, the federal government, the states, and the cities all can see where they plug into these goals and move towards them. So just a timeline, and again, we've kind of talked about this, but just to reiterate it, 1972, first conference on the human environment, recognized the challenges of growth. Excuse me for 1 second here. 1992, the Rio Earth Summit. 2000 was the adoption of the Millennium Development Goals, which the primary goal of that was eradicating extreme poverty. As we've kind of talked about throughout the semester, sustainability is intimately connected to poverty. Low-income folks tend to have, tend to live in much worse environments. They tend to be much more affected by environmental pollution, other environmental hazards, natural hazards, and the like. They tend to, obviously, because they're in poverty, they have less economic opportunity than other people, and they also tend to have less social cohesion and less social capital. All of these things are intertwined. There is enormous evidence that shows social capital and economic conditions are strongly intertwined, and that by improving one or the other, you can have an impact on both, right? So the benefits of those goals and having that kind of laser focus on eradicating poverty is that we have seen more people being lifted out of poverty across the globe than ever before. So if you remember back to our lectures about poverty, there are now fewer people across the globe living in poverty than ever before, both in terms of a percentage of the population, but also in terms of just raw numbers of people living in extreme poverty. So we've made enormous strides in eradicating extreme poverty, raising the quality of life for people across the world. But of course, that comes at an environmental cost as well. As people make more money, they tend to consume more and have a bigger environmental footprint. So the model that seemed to work pretty well for this approach is to richer countries were seen as contributors, and they provided much of the funding that went to serve these developing nations where much of the global poverty is found. And so, countries with more wealth gave some of that, invested some of their wealth into these developing nations as a way to lift people out of poverty. So in 2012, the Rio Plus 20 conference recognized that there had been progress made, particularly again in that goal of eradicating poverty, but there was still remained some significant challenges, and we needed to kind of broaden the scope of our ideas around sustainable development, and so that led to the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. So I want you to think about, kind of as we talk about some of this stuff, hopefully again drawing on things we've talked about in class, what are some of the challenges and the barriers that might inhibit the implementation of these goals. So as we go into talking about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, what are some things that might keep them from being implemented? Sorry. So some of the background to the Sustainable Development Goals, they should address and incorporate in a balanced way all three dimensions of sustainable development and their interlinkages. So again, we're going back to that idea of sustainability being about the environment, being about the economy, and being about social equity and social sustainability. So all three of those pillars have a role to play if we're going to foster genuine sustainability. We can't ignore one or the other of those three because it is a three-legged stool, and you take out one of the legs and the thing's not stable. So the Sustainable Development Goals are a transition from the Millennium Development Goals and intended to spur action, again, across jurisdictions. So at the international level, the national level, and the local level as well. Like any goal, they're supposed to be concise, aspirational, and globally applicable. So as you can imagine, when you have 17 goals, that's a lot. It's hard to balance all of them. And when we look at them in a little more detail, you'll see some of the conflicts that might arise between them. And so trying to balance all of those 17 goals in a meaningful way can be really difficult. And what you see is that some countries are prioritizing some of these over others. And so in some cases, you see a real priority continuing with poverty eradication, things like that. Other countries, particularly the more advanced countries that are fairly financially well off, you're seeing a lot more focus on some of the environmental goals and priorities because they're not worried about where their next meal is coming from, right? They have the luxury of worrying about their global footprint in terms of the environment over just fundamental basic economics, food needs, those kinds of things. And so when we look into these 17 goals, you can see them across the board here. So no poverty remains the first goal listed here. So again, that idea that global poverty contributes to environmental and social instability and unsustainability. And so if we can eradicate poverty, that's going to make enormous progress on many of the other goals, like no hunger, good health, education, gender equality. All of those things are connected to poverty, right? Clean water, affordable and clean energy, work and economic growth, industry, innovation, infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, strong institutions, and partnership for the goals. So hopefully you can start to connect the dots between things that we've talked about all semester, things like good governance. How does that relate to these goals? Social sustainability, where does that connect into these goals? Ecosystems, biodiversity, all of those things that we've been talking about for the last couple of months are all connected to the 17 goals of the Sustainable Development Goals. So you can hopefully see that holistic approach when we talk about sustainability and how that's defined within these 17 things. So why does this matter? Why do we need to worry about identifying goals? Because when you identify your goals, that gets people motivated. It spurs social mobilization. When you can go to a government or a nonprofit organization or a bunch of volunteers and say, we are going to do this specific action, and that action is tied to this specific goal, people are much more motivated to do that, right? It's easier to bring in a crowd if you have an actual plan of action and you can assign tasks to people and they can see movement towards those goals, right? If you just call for volunteers and say, hey, show up and we're going to do something, no one's going to show up. But if you say, we are going to show up and we're going to plant 100 trees in our community park on Saturday, you'll get people showing up for that because there's a specific action, there's a specific goal of planting 100 trees, and people will see the benefit of that immediately. They'll have that feeling of accomplishment by being part of something. And so when you identify your goals, you allow that motivation to happen. It starts to promote positive peer pressure. As we're seeing with coronavirus right now, there is a lot of negative peer pressure being put on people who are seen as violating social distancing, right? You watch the news, you hear stories, you see people posting on Facebook, tearing apart people that are hoarding toilet paper, right? They're violating social norms that go with the crisis we're facing right now. You see stories, lambasting the kids that were down on the beach in Florida over spring break, because they were violating this idea of social distancing and contributing to the spread and longevity of the crisis we're facing right now. And I don't know if you followed the story at all, but now a bunch of those kids who were down there partying in Florida have been tested and they're positive for coronavirus. And of course, now they've all gone home and brought it home with them. So hopefully the negative peer or the negative peer pressure against violating the social distancing and staying inside and not traveling and so forth will promote better behavior from people. So when we have goals, researchers, practitioners, policymakers can coordinate actions. So when we think about things like green energy, there's a role for researchers, academics, the university professors and others to research best practices and identify new ways to generate green energy. And practitioners, the folks out there actually building the wind generators, building the solar panels, installing those things, right? They have a role to play, and policymakers as well, in terms of, putting in place policies where energy companies will buy back extra electricity generated from a home solar installation, right? So all three players, you can see the role in contributing to the spread of, say, solar energy, from the research, making more efficient, more effective solar panels, to the people building and installing them, to the policymakers setting the policy that makes it affordable for people to install it. And you can see how all of them coordinate towards that goal of green energy and improving our energy production. And you can mobilize stakeholder networks. So people who have a particular passion or interest in an issue can come together, again, coordinate with the researchers and practitioners and policymakers and move towards that common goal. So just think in your own life, right? If you actually want to accomplish something, whether it be, you want to lose 20 pounds, you want to get more fit, you want to get a better grade in the class, the first thing you have to do is set the specific goal. I want to lose 20 pounds by July 1st. I want to bring my average in this class up to an A by April 15th or whatever it is, right? Once you identify that specific goal, and then you orient your action towards that goal. And so if you're working towards a goal of a better grade, right, some of the actions you would take towards that goal are meet with your professor and find out why you're not doing well. Is it, you just don't understand the material, or you not turning in your assignments, whatever it might be. Identify what the challenge is that you're facing in achieving that goal, and then you can work towards accomplishing it. So one of the ways that we can achieve these goals is through a process called backcasting. And that's where you set a goal and a target date for that goal, then work backwards to identify what needs to be done to achieve it. So for this class, the book review is due April 24th. It is still due April 24th, so if you're listening to this lecture, just know that yes, you have to turn that in April 24th. And if you have questions or issues with it, please email me as soon as possible, and I will try and answer those as best I can. So you might think, okay, if the project is due April 24th, have to upload it to Canvas by then, I want to have the first draft complete by April 20th. That'll give me a few days to review it, revise it, and get it turned in on time. So if my due date, or if my date for that is the 20th, then I want to start writing it on the 18th. So I'm not rushing to try and finish it. I have some time to kind of think through and put down a good first draft. I'm going to give myself a couple days for that. So if that's the case, then I want to have my notes and outline done by the 17th. And that means I have to read, X chapters per week to complete the book by the 17th. So by working backwards from the due date, you can put in those intermediate dates to have different steps of the process done. Now, to accomplish that, you have to think through the process of achieving the goal. So you have the goal of a finished book review. You're going to have a first draft. You're going to have an outline. You're going to have to actually read the damn book because, that's important. And so you can put dates onto all of those things, and that gives you that understanding of what you have to accomplish by when, and lets you break it into smaller, more manageable chunks so that you're not staring at, oh crap, I've got this whole thing I've got to do. It's okay, this week I've got to read 3 chapters next week, 3 chapters the week after that. Then I'm done. I can do my outline. Hopefully you've taken notes as you've read. Do your outline, write the draft, polish it, edit it, and go online with it. So that's what backcasting is. It's a great way to accomplish a goal, especially if it's a goal that the process for. So it's an effective means of organizing your work when you know the process to get to the goal. You don't always have that luxury, in terms of making big changes or trying to achieve something that we haven't yet figured out. You don't necessarily have that luxury of backcasting to where you can, define the process and set it out from the goal to the beginning. So there are some other practices you might want to think about. Technology road mapping. So that's less about getting to, that's less about laying out a process with things all the way through as you do with backcasting. It's really about what's the pathway. How do I define the roadmap? Obviously it's in the name, to achieving the goal. What are the potential obstacles? How can we take steps to overcome identified obstacles? So if we take green energy as an example, obstacles include the intermittent nature of production, lack of storage technology and capacity, production distance from where it's needed, particularly with things like wind energy. The wind plants are often far from the population centers. And so what you would do then is overcome each of those obstacles intermittently, or as intermediate steps towards the final goal. So you would focus first on, what do we do about the intermittent nature? How do we expand storage and make it more efficient and more cost effective so that we can deal with the intermittent issue? And how do we improve the efficiency of transmission because we're generating power far from the destination? How can we take those steps to move the ball forward towards that final goal? So you don't necessarily know what all the individual steps will be like you do with backcasting. You just know that these are the obstacles we're going to have to overcome, and we're going to meander our way to them and through them till we achieve our final goal. So some issues is that we don't always know what we don't know. So I think we're living through one of those challenges we wouldn't expect to arise right now. If you look back even a month ago, consumer confidence was the highest it's been in decades. Unemployment was the lowest it's been in decades. The stock market was at record highs. Most people were feeling pretty good about things. So people were pretty happy with the economic direction of the country, feeling relatively stable in their jobs for the most part. Not everybody, but people were feeling good about things. And then here we are, it's March 22nd when I'm recording this, and the whole world is upside down. We're looking at millions of people losing their jobs. We're looking at tens of thousands potentially of small businesses going under. We're looking at tens of thousands of deaths potentially, an enormous change in conditions across the board because of this virus out of China. So just a bizarre circumstance that completely upends where we thought we'd be and how we thought we'd be functioning at this point in our lives. I mean, I'm supposed to be today in the Netherlands, being able to enjoy touring Rotterdam, and instead I'm sitting on my couch recording a lecture that hopefully will work as I post it online, and hopefully people will actually watch and learn from. And occasionally, when we get so goal oriented, we oftentimes lose the capacity to be flexible and adapt to changing conditions and changing challenges that we're facing. I think we've all probably known people in our lives who are so focused on one particular thing that they don't know how to change that focus. They don't know how to adapt when life throws them a curveball. And so it can be really hard for those folks to be flexible in the face of adversity if they're so set on achieving that goal. And I think life is complicated, the world is complicated, and we have to recognize that the path we thought we were going to go forward on is not always the path we're going to get to stay on. And we have to act accordingly and adjust our priorities accordingly. But when we have a larger vision and we have a larger set of goals, that still gives us something to move towards, even if we're moving in a different direction for a while, right? So we might have to get off on a tangent for a bit, but if we have that larger goal, it keeps us hopefully on track in the grander scheme of things. Okay. So successful implementation will require public and private investments, right? These goals are intended for all of us to be a part of. It's not just about governments stepping up and doing things. It's going to take investments and what's the word I'm looking for? Adaptations and innovations. That's the word. Innovations from the private sector to drive the goals forward. So we talk about cell phones as a great example of a private innovation that's actually had an enormous economic and social impact on the developing world. So cell phones have been globally adopted, and they actually represent an enormous opportunity for developing nations, because landlines require exactly that. They require wires strung across the landscape to connect phone systems. So, if you when I was a kid, back in my day, when I was a kid, and there weren't cell phones, if you wanted to make a phone call, you had to be in your house or a payphone, and it was connected in a physical, by a physical cable to a central exchange, and then from that central exchange, another cable went out to whatever phone you were calling, right? So you can imagine, that infrastructure in the United States built up over 100 years. I mean, we had telegraph lines in the 1800s. Then we started stringing, then once the phone was invented, Alexander Graham Bell invented the phone, we started building the phone lines to connect the world. We don't have to do that anymore. Now you can put in place cell phone towers, and those individual towers serve a larger area. So instead of having to build thousands and thousands of miles of physical lines to connect homes together and businesses and so forth, you can put in cell towers and achieve universal phone service across the country. And so you can imagine, in developing nations that don't have the infrastructure that we take for granted here in the States, you can start to provide cell phone service much easier than you would be able to phone service, with landlines. And so that's just an example of how a private development of cell phones can have an enormous benefit to the public by improving access to social connections. People can talk to one another easier. It improves economic opportunities because people can connect via the phone to employers. They can connect businesses together. They can access the internet through their cell phones. So you've created this enormous benefit to the public through this private investment that oftentimes is supported and subsidized by governments. So even here in the United States, we have some government subsidies to provide access to more rural areas for everyone to have. And of course, we had the Obama phones. If y'all heard about those, it was a little bit of a, not a scandal, but just something that Republicans were all up in arms about the government subsidizing cell phones for low income families, because it was seen as, the benefit of having a cell phone was seen as an important one to offer to people. So again, that's government subsidizing, partnering with private providers to fill a need for people. There are some problems where, excuse me, public investment is certainly necessary to address needs. One of the primary examples of this is water and wastewater infrastructure, because these are not typically money-making utilities, right? Electricity is actually not a profit generator for cities, but cities that own their own electric system tend to, the revenues it generates can be used to subsidize other activities. Water and wastewater tends to be less so, and so there's much less private investment in water and wastewater. There are private utility providers across the country and across the globe. So private companies see a economic value in providing electricity. Not so much water and wastewater. There are some, but not like with electricity companies. So ensuring people have access to clean water and proper wastewater infrastructure is a critical priority for public investment across the globe. Affordable housing. The market in housing doesn't provide much in the way of affordable housing. So there is a need for public investment to provide adequate housing for all people. Here in the United States, we have a very mixed bag in terms of affordable housing. So we have large numbers of people who are homeless, some by choice, some by, because of mental health and drug abuse and other challenges, don't have the capacity to adequately house themselves, or, struggle to find appropriate housing. People just can't afford it. So all of these are challenges with housing, particularly here in the United States. And the private market tends to focus on building more higher end housing. That's where the most profit is available, and so that's what tends to get built. Additionally, we have policies that make housing more expensive and harder to build. So there's a public opportunity to, one, look at the policies and practices that make housing more expensive, as well as just subsidize housing for those who need it. Ensuring food security. So making sure that food that is produced gets to market, that if there is food aid involved, which we talked about, that the food aid is being distributed properly, making sure that corruption isn't skimming off the top and misplacing or misallocating resources that need to go to the people. And you can probably think of some others where public investment is important. As we're seeing right now with the coronavirus, investments in public health matter a lot. Ensuring that there are adequate supplies and backups of things like respirators and protective equipment and all of those things that we need in large numbers, that the private sector won't provide because they're trying to make a profit. They're working on relatively small margins, and it's not financially feasible or sustainable for a private hospital or a private network to have 1,000 respirators just sitting in a storage unit in case of emergency, right? That's a role where federal governments and state governments should play an active role in having that equipment, that sort of backup for when the emergencies happen, as kind of the backstop to the private sector. That's a role where government can be an important player and should have a key role in doing that. So the video here, again, I'm going to link that in the module so you can watch it. Talks about how we're doing. Talks about progress that's been made towards the sustainable goals, and things are pretty good. We're making progress. We're moving the ball forward on many of the goals. We're continuing to see improvements and reductions in global poverty. We're seeing improvements in global health outside of obviously the current events. We are seeing progress in things like green energy. We're seeing better management of fisheries and other food sources. So there is progress being made towards those sustainable development goals, and hopefully we will continue to do so. Here in the United States, where we're seeing the most progress really is at the cities level. So cities like New York, San Francisco, Seattle, Austin, places, Madison, places like that have taken really the most active role in terms of working towards the sustainable development goals, supporting things like access to housing, green energy, food security. All of those things are being worked on very significantly at the local level. There are some states making progress, again, tend to be the more liberal leaning states, California, Oregon, Washington, cities in the Northeast, are making significant progress towards the sustainable development goals. As a nation, in some ways, we are making great progress. Our CO2 emissions are down below or at or below 1992 levels, so we are making enormous strides in reducing our carbon output, largely because of fracking and the transition to natural gas. Other goals, we're not doing so well on, and with who knows how this coronavirus is going to affect these things. It could have positive impact if it changes our way of thinking about the world around us and how we interact with it. It could have a negative consequence if we come out from this and just go crazy thinking, okay, we dodged a bullet there, we're gonna just live large, because who knows what's gonna happen next. People have that tendency for sure when they feel like, whew, missed that one, let's go crazy now, and they start partying hard, and who knows. We'll see how this goes and what happens. But anyway, take a few minutes, review the goals, think about them, and watch this video, because it is a useful metric to understand the progress that's being made and the work being done to accomplish these goals. Take care.